am Dr. Harvey Kushner. I'm director of the Homeland Security and Terrorism Institute at Long Island University. I think it's very important, given the nature of who wants to attack us, to be much more vigilant of the lone wolf, the individual. Very difficult to ferret out who is an individual who would attack us, but I think, for example, cyberspace, let's take that, is extraordinarily vulnerable. I think more money has to be spent in the public arena to educate the general public about the threat to cyberspace. I think there has to be more liaison between the private and the public sector in dealing with the issue. Certainly the first line of defense in the 21st century for cyberspace is not our government, but rather the private sector itself. So I think there has to be more outreach in that. And I think there's not enough. And recent attacks of government computers as well as the private sector have borne out that this is a viable target for the terrorists. Well, local law enforcement obviously is going to be probably the one who's exposed the most, and sometimes with the least amount of information. So I think really it's important for the general law enforcement to liaison better with the federal government. There needs to be more a joint terrorism task force, and probably real-time information has to be transferred almost immediately. And they can't be the last ones to know when something's happening. So I think communication really is the biggest issue that local law enforcement faces. I think the threat to the United States, certainly prior to 9/11 and sometime after 9/11, was these massive al-Qaeda long-ranged planned attacks. I think ISIS, or ISIL if you wish, has dummied it down considerably, has said use whatever you can. And it's a shorter event planning stage, and it makes it much more difficult to unearth the attack when it's almost instantaneously. I think law enforcement agencies need to have as much state-of-advanced technological equipment as our military to a great extent, whether it's night vision goggles or whether it's an armored vehicle. I think it's improper training in the use of these the equipment that's at issue. But I, for one, think it's very important to at least give the firepower to our police that the bad guys have. You don't want to pull back on the ability to give the appropriate type of equipment to law enforcement. I think there are other social issues involved, behavioral issues, but I don't think it's an issue involving whether or not. I think when you say military, the police, I think that's the wrong term used. I think it's a proper use of a technique in using the weaponry. I think the greatest threat is complacency. And I think it's also what our government does, long range. I think we like to blame local law enforcement sometimes for that, but I think they're just a victim the same as any other citizen. I think it all starts in Washington and our relationship with other nation states and our foreign policy. I think we have to be much more aggressive in terms of demanding that our foreign leaders adhere to American policy. You know, quite frankly, take the airline industry, for example. We're very strict here. TSA is strict, the FAA is strict in rules and regulations on flying in and out of the United States. But there are many foreign carriers that come into the United States on a daily basis that have very little security, and their rules and regulations are quite different. But in fear of our relationships with these foreign carriers, we do very little. But I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. I do think we're fearful of offending someone, but I think when you live in a dangerous neighborhood and you're a target 24/7, and especially in certain cities in the United States, I think you have to be very aggressive, and sometimes someone's rights are going to get violated. But you know, when there's a ticking bomb, you have to be able to up the ante in order to stop something from happening where tens of thousands of people are injured. Well, I think for law enforcement, especially if you reach the high levels of administration, I think it's important to instill an understanding of what the threat is. And that means you cannot let complacency set in. You have to constantly have a training program together, which you will, on a daily basis almost, or at least on a weekly basis, inform your employees of what the threat is and how to deal with it. And I think counterterrorism procedures have to be routinely intermingled with normal law enforcement operations. It's a shame that we have to do this, but unfortunately what's happened in other regions of the world are going to face us here.